Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah al-Jalil al-Kareem. Al-Mumin al-Hakim. Al-Wahid al-Aziz. Al-Malik al-Hakim. Al-Wali al-Wahhab. Al-Haq. As-Salam. Juma Mubarak. Today we're going to hopefully do a short one. Short and sweet. Paradox in Islam. So, logically speaking, I once said to my cousin, who is a former addict, so it was a little bit spacey, but I think he became a Buddhist, as one does. And he said, "Oh yeah, that's a paradox." I don't remember what the inciting thing was. And I said, "Well, everything is a paradox." And he said, "Yeah, yeah, it is." And I told my father about this, who's more of an orderly thinking Thomist Catholic sort of reasoning pseudo philosopher, and he said, "Well, that doesn't mean anything. That's just party talk." But actually, in a strict philosophical framework of set theory, everything in particular is not a paradox. Like this plant is this tree is what it is. This tree is a part of the set of everything. There's nothing paradoxical about the tree being a tree. It is what it is, right? So that's where that statement is party talk. But everything, capital E, as in the concept of the set of all things, is paradoxical because the set of all things as a logi is included in the set, right? This is something that we get into in like Gödel Escher Bach and Eternal Golden Braid, and that we get into with the concept of transfinite numbers, describing the size of different countable infinities or uncountable infinities based on different mathematical frameworks. And what about the set of all possible axiomatic descriptions of these sets of infinite size, and so on, right? And therefore, Allahu Akbar. Okay. So the foundational, before we even get to Tawheed, because you could then assert different things about the nature of this allness. For instance, the Christians, of course, have the Trinity, and the Trinity is sort of a strange loop reasoning. I've been chatting with a few people. A woman actually put it to me in the Progressive Islam chat when someone was asking about the salvation of non-Muslims. And I was talking about the paradox of God either having libertarian free will and just does everything out of sheer sovereign, almost arbitrary. It's like a black box, right? So God becomes this terrifying other who might nullify all your good deeds because you said the wrong thing or believed the wrong thing, and so on. Versus the Thomist idea, or at least how I understand it, they deny that the Thomist Trinity of a divine simplicity has to be this unfolding of a logos and the love between the logos and the original Ase, God the Father, is a necessitarian thing. But I think divine simplicity tends to go into that, and the Aryans and the Ishmaelis with their created logos as a necessary act of God's perfection, the one perfect eternal act is distinctly necessitarian. That, in other words, instead of it being God doing things by decree because why not? God just sort of felt like it, whatever that means, and there's a regress. Why did God feel? The libertarian theology has its own canards, but then the necessitarian one is sort of that. Well, it just had to be this way. That God is ontologically prone to this either emanation or the unfolding of the Trinity as essential to God's nature. So whereas in Maturidi, Asheri, Athery and Eastern Orthodox theology, whatever their model of God is doing things simply because God wants to do them for whatever reason. God is beyond having a reason for wanting to do things, which also sort of is a paradox, because then isn't that a necessitarian thing as well? There's no causality behind God's libertarian free will. So it just becomes a way of saying, well, I think that this M.C. Escher painting is of angels, and then they say, no, I think it's of devils. It depends on if you look at it where the white part is the ground or the black part is the ground. Necessity versus liberty. They're both ways of saying, I don't know, God just did it. And when I think about analogies to cosmology and how there's a holography of the event horizon of black holes, and how the universe is said to be a three-dimensional, or really it's four-dimensional, it's three spatial plus time, a four-dimensional hologram on a larger dimensional bulk. And I think that's quite interesting as well. And this reminds me of this idea of a necessary logos, whether it's sort of created or it's not. It's, it unfolds, but it's a begetting. It's not. It's different from other creation. To me, that's not as interesting of a paradox. So, but it's important to remember that what is really fundamental to Islam is Allahu Akbar, and this Godelian dissolvation of any system or formal concept that we have of God, without going all the way like some Buddhists, like what you would consider the more mainstream understanding of Buddhism from a Western perspective. This is not really indicative of Pure Land's Mahayana or Tibetan Buddhism, but where everything dissolves and therefore you continue to do so and negate everything, which is sort of also Hegelian. And Hegel maybe is a little bit more constructive than even that. And then like Nietzsche rejected it, but anyway, they all went in weird directions, overreacting, as one does, as the different theological predecessors of these philosophers also did. So then, okay, so we're not going to understand God, but we can appreciate them, and that this appreciation is the beginning of piety, the beginning of taqwa. So then we come, having having established the limits of our ability to assert fundamental ultimate reality, we can have our theories that we prefer. And this is the different theological schools. But okay, so now we come to the paradox. From the paradox of everything, we come to the paradox of Tawheed. That following the Quranic revelation, reifying the Judaic interpretation of the Torah, rather than a Ishad, O Israel, your God is Ishad, being a sort of asterisk, like what that doesn't, but there's multiplicity in God. So we say no, there isn't. It's Yashid and Ishad, that is one in an absolute sense. So Tawheed is a conjugation of Wahid, which is the cousin word of Yashid in Hebrew, which complements Ahad from being distinctly unique. So the Trinity is distinctly unique, and also a married couple is distinctly unique. If they divorce and remarry, that's a different couple. So they're Ahad, and then they're separated, and then they're Ahad with another partner, right? But they're two different people. Well, technically, now we're talking about there's four people involved in this divorce and remarrying of the original couple. That's quite a lot of people. But God is one. So God is actually one person, not three people. This is basic Islam, right? Yam lam yulid walam yulad. Walam yakun kufuwan ahad. Allah Akbar. And so we come back to the original contemplation without a revelatory framework of the one and the many. That there's one reality. You might say, well, no, the reality is this complex chaos between multipolar fundamental dynamics, maybe a dualistic one, maybe it's even more complex than that. The Quran denigrates this. It says no, like things would be corrupt from all the competition between fundamental realities. There's one reality. It's one God. And so, Plato was cool with this. And one could argue this is the most successful dawah in the history of Islam. The Sufis telling Hindus that Adam alayhi salam was actually this sort of Vishnaic superhuman in the primordial times who taught monotheism. So actually, what you're doing is not completely abandoning Hinduism. You're taking on this mystical monotheism, which is the deeper, true foreground of all of these Vedic traditions that you've been practicing, and you can keep meditating and so on. You just do it monotheistically. That really worked. It was more effective than the Mughal conquest as far as inculcating real Islam. And of course, now in the subcontinent, we have in modernity the Deobandis and the Salafis and versus Brailvis, who are more in that vein of having this Logai, Hakika Muhammadiyah, sort of Brahma, sub Brahman hierarchy. And the Deobandis are like, no, you're mushriks, etc. It goes on and on. The sectarianism never ends, folks. And so Plato was really just recapitulating the Vedic contemplations in an Occidental framework, titrated through Persia. And the Persians had Zoroastrianism already for several centuries, where there's one god that we're loyal to, but there are various Yazadas, not to be confused with Yazid ibn Muawiyah, the accursed. But that these are sort of worthy of worship. That's what Yazada means. So instead, it's not there's no God worthy of worship but Allah. It's there's these sort of these aspects of God, right? And so we get this in Asherism, where the Yazadas are the different metaphysical organs of Allah: the knowledge, the power, the will, the life. And I think of this Asheri concept as sort of like God is a divine supercomputer. So there's the plug, you need to plug in the computer, that's the life. Okay, so now we've got this essential current of divine essence flowing through God, the sort of these essential attributes subsisting in the essence but distinct from the essence. The life is like this electricity flow of the essential divine reality manifesting in God's organs. And then we have the knowledge is like the webcam, and the speech is like the monitor, and the will is like the CPU, and so on. The power is like the robot arm that does the Skynet on you at some point on Judgment Day, and also in the form of Cotter as well, right? In this occasionalist Asheri framework. So obviously, I don't believe in that because I believe that is not true Tawheed, and I think it's even possibly shirk. It's you're not attributing a level of agency or personhood. They're not sophisticated enough metaphysical divine organs to be, it's not like the little quatoids or whatever from Total Recall, or whichever movie it was, where the little guy is in the stomach and he's like, "Open your mind," and so it's like, he's a part of me. My quatoid is a part of me, but he's got his own head, his own personality. But he's a part of my, he's an attribute of my body. Is that I have this little guy living on my tummy, right? So this would be more like a hypostasis, to be incredibly disrespectful to that theology. So the Asheris are like, no, we're different. Yeah, we have multiplicity in God, but this is just how, it is what it is, guys. There's 7 divine attributes that are really important. Just because there's 7 Yazadas in Zoroastrianism, it's a coincidence. Okay, we're not Magi, we're not Majusis. Okay, and so obviously as a Mutazili, I believe that, like the Thomists, but without the Trinity, that the attributes are just adjectives that are part of the revelation to help us understand God and to come to a deeper appreciation of God's essence. And so they're all one in the essence. They aren't distinct or subsisting, whatever that would mean in the essence. Um, it's just that God is wise and just and merciful, and these are all the same thing. That's like. What do you mean by justice? You mean executing everybody, or justice can mean a lot of things depending on who's interpreting it. Well, but there's wisdom, so you trust it's a good interpretation. Okay, well, what? How does that unfold? Well, there's mercy involved. God's merciful. Well, how is God merciful? Well, God's forgiving. Okay, so you get all these names of Allah in the Quran, and they all reflect on each other. And but God's also the debaser. He's he misguides people, or he allows people to be misguided. Right, but that's just and merciful in a way because they're bad, so it's fair, and it's merciful to the other people who are really putting in the effort. Okay, very well. Maturidi is a little bit more sophisticated than the Ashari divine supercomputer. I consider it to be a little bit closer to Mutazilism. They're both basically 40 and 60% Mutazila theology. We've covered the emanationist Ismaili theology, the Zaydis um, and Twelver Shia have the Mutazili theology. This is they don't you don't hear them talking about it very much, and they adopt the Mutazili sort of guidance principles, the usul, to varying extents. You don't really hear about it much. You hear about the Houthis, you hear about Iran. Shiism could be doing a lot better, frankly. Um, but it's got potential. It's got some good stuff in it from the Mutaziliya and the Falsafa, their adjuncts. The Mutaziliya became a disjointed tradition, and so everybody's trying. And then there's Athari, which one's not even. But Athari would say, well, actually, we have the most Tawhid because we believe God. We like affirm all of these bits and pieces of Hadith and Quran in a literal sense. And so we affirm that. We believe God has a hand and a foot. There was this hadith about putting the foot over at the top of the hellfire to kind of keep a lid on it. We believe in that. So God has a foot. And there's no other hadith where it says God has another foot. So we assume God just has one leg and one foot because that's all that's been disclosed to us. If God wanted to disclose a second leg and foot for symmetry, there would be another hadith about it, or it would have come up in that the hadith would have said, oh, and then God's other foot is like creating a center of gravity. And then it's like, well, what's gravity in the akhirah? Where's the center of the akhirah as well, right? That God's divine mujassima form is being oriented towards. It began, and we don't ask the kafia, except Ibn Taymiyyah couldn't help himself, and so now we have Salafi bros doing analytic philosophy, trying to apply, you know, Heidegger being and becoming semantics to probably Daif hadiths from the 8th century. So that's fun in its own way. Maybe God, this the Quran says I could have made you one community, but I created basically a multiplicity of beliefs to challenge you. I'm paraphrasing. So this is where we have the fun of we get to go and hopefully respectfully. The problem is it becomes disrespectful, but hopefully respectfully tease out, what does it mean to do analytic philosophy on the idea of God gaining attributes temporally in the Thamian system, or the Kefi. I like the Hanbali don't ask how concept because there's a certain mystical veneer to it. So the one in the many, one reality, but multiplicity of experiences and forms. And with that, also, how would a transcendent God also be immanent? The Jewish mystics have a term he, not he. I forget what it is in Arabic. Hu la hua in Arabic. I don't know the Hebrew off the top of my head. And you just accept the paradox. So in Mutazilism, we don't have a logos as God's fundamental contractor to solve this agency problem. you do have the angels. The angels are a pillar of faith. So you've got all the tools you need in the Quran to say, well, God, the reason why we is used, for example, is not because God is referring to a fundamental multiplicity. It's more like in the Genesis, where the Elohim are like all the divinely aligned agents. Whoever is acting in God's will is an Elohim, and this would perhaps include saints and messianic kings as well, inshallah, as they say. And it's quite applicable to this concept. And so the fundamental difference between, and this is where the Asharis differ with the Mutazili, and where the Mutazili maybe are on an off foot, is that you need the divine revelation to make the leap from this purely inductive monad of Plato and the Vedic philosophers through, therefore, we resolve this paradox through a succession of emanated agencies down to the demiurge and then everything that we can observe. Um, Whereas in Metazilism, you would just say, well, God just does it. Right? So God intervenes in history. There's divine speech. The divine speech, obviously, in Abadism and Metazilism, and Shiism, and most 2/3 of Quranists, when surveyed, indicated they believe the Quran is created, and not even in a slice and dice sense of the Ashari system, but like it's all everything's created, right? That's how we solve the paradox of everything, is that God is maybe not even a thing, so God is outside that superset, and so on, right? And then we get into, well, how do we interpret this text? So I'm of the disposition that the text is pointing to other things, and it's sitting on top of a vast corpus over 2,000 years, including the what's the word? Not necessarily the Vedas, but probably the Avestas of Zarathustra. But then again, which ones are authentic? And this is a problem with the Tanakh, and this is a problem with the Injil associated literature, and obviously with the Hadith. And so we get to have an exercise of this, right? And there's a great many things the Quran leaves as an exercise to the reader. There's infamous ambiguities of language, which, if we believe in the divine precision of this speech, must have been intentional to challenge us. So it's not simply a prescriptive. It is, in a large extent, a prescriptive text, but there's also challenges in there for us to interpret it more or less wisely. And what does wisdom mean? And so then we get into like the Ruhudus. So the Ruhudus is another paradox in Islam, because, and it ties in with the paradox of continuity. So atheists would say, well, this is all just a series of accretions. Everyone is just making things up based on things that they've heard. It's all memes. There's a Richard Dawkins theory of viral and genetically evolving ideas. And then a Christian would say, no, 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 it's legit up to this point, and then they started making things up. So they're just anti divine revelation. Or they'll say, well, there's a lot of good intertextual stuff in the Quran. So it seems like there's a level of intelligence here that goes beyond caravan conversations. But therefore, this is from Satan, because you fall into an epistemic problem of isolating God. Once you have this Tawhidi concept of God, you then fall into an adhocracy around law, and you become Pharisaic, which is a legitimate criticism. And that is in part because those Muslims have made kufr, they have covered the truth of the ayati, of the signs that the Quran is pointing to, which are outside the Quran, which is the Injil, this idea of mercy being first and foremost before you worry about, is my prayer invalidated? God is not a vending machine. God is not Skynet, mashallah. It had to be this way. If it was the other way, like they think, then reality would be a hell reality fundamentally, and that's the world that they live in. And it's a quite terrifying incarnation of Satanism, because it's asserting that Satan is God. And so this is fundamentally across the sects, and including progressive, or whatever you want to call them, more enlightened interpretations of Sunni, like early Maliki, early Hanafi. This is what we are fighting against and trying to bring renewed guidance into the deen. And so you'll have the one rejection is to say, no, it's exclusive. The other rejection is to say, oh, the Sir Amida is telling us to just go back and read John and then be Trinitarians. Even though, subsequent to saying that indeed the Jews and the Christians and the Sabians, whoever believes in God on the last day, can be saved, paraphrasing, and they will not fear or grieve. But then immediately it says that, but those who say this Trinity stuff, God is, don't say God is a third of three. Don't say, um, the other thing. I don't even want to say. It's actually pretty clear because those verses are immediately following the carrot. Then you get the stick. So it's a correction of the earlier theology, and I think those Islamic dilemma Christians are not being very ingenuous to the text. They're not giving it a charitable reading, it's a polemic reading. But then when you slice and dice and you zoom in and you find that this Islamic dilemma question is actually a very interesting question because there are a number of things that tease out allusions to truth that can fall one way or another. So you can resolve the paradox by just assuming Christianity is fine and the Quran is somehow endorsing it, maybe through the Hawariyun from a Catholic ecclesial point of view. So the Catholics are better off, but the Catholics have been guided in their ecclesial lineage through the recent, liberal Argentine Pope to and Vatican II before that, and so on. The Freemasons subverting the place into saying, well, the Muslims can actually be saved too. Isn't that nice? So they've adopted this 569 perspective from the church. So there's something paradoxical about that as well, but that's a mashallah. And then you look at the guidance of the Injil, and that the other paradox. There's a couple of paradoxes that relate to this: the paradox of the Nabi and the paradox of the Messiah, and the paradox of the Ruhudus, almost like a trinity, but not really. But there just happen to be three of them that interrelate to this sort of Islam, this continuity paradox. So the paradox of the Messiah is that the Messiah, you basically have to affirm that Jesus, alayhi salam, was al-Masih, the Messiah, not just a Messiah. But the Quran doesn't really give us any color for that. And then we see that the epistemology of early Islam is trying to ascribe Nas to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam, to Umar and Abu Bakr. This idea was then later diluted into like the idea of the Rashidun, because it was also competing with the Shia idea of Nas for Imam Ali alayhi salam and his lineage through Hussein. And then of course you had the Hassanids, which you never hear about. Like, what about Hassan alayhi salam? He's a Hobey, right? What about his lineage? He had children. Well, there isn't a Shia branch that is really active. Even the Zaydis. Zayd was a descendant of Hussein, I believe. So anyway, don't worry about it. Don't think about it too much. What about the Prophet's adopted son, Zayd? We don't talk about it. So there's this tension where we're trying to round out the Quran and fill in details about fiqh through guidance from whoever has Nas, because we got used to, as the Medinans, this idea that like we can go to the Prophet and get specific information about things. And he said, don't write it down. So he wanted it to be something that is sort of an ad hoc improvisational guidance to, scuttle things along. And of course, okay, now we're going to go to war. You line up here, you dig a trench there. We're going to win this battle. And, well, we got used to that. We don't know how to be Muslim. We're even just compiling the Quran in a standardized form in the time of Uthman, and people have not really had access to reading the Quran in a widespread way until about 20 years ago, to be honest. Otherwise, it was this elite minority of literate people who also then, in addition to being 5% who were literate, they're the 5% or 10% of the 5% who have the time to actually like really read over the Quran and then all the Hadith to try to understand the Quran, and then here's what other people said with the tafsir, and you go all into it. And it created this exclusivist mindset in part because of bandwidth. People just didn't have the access to all the information. Reading the Bible and doing intertextual analysis of the Bible was discouraged. It was hard to get manuscripts of that, harder than like Sahih Bukhari, and so on. So you can see how, and then in addition with the social pressures and the dogmas and the ulema military alliance and the ICTA land rentier rent seeking system, you can see how this all, and then obviously, by the way, we'll execute you if we think you've said something that's kufr. And what we think is kufr is a very ambiguous, so there was a fatwa on islamqa.info that believing in the conservation of energy is kufr because it's denying that Allah can create energy, which is like, well, no, in an Ibn Sina framework, you just extrapolate that into the framework of creation. And so whether there's eternity of creation or conservation of energy is all contextual to the creation. So it's not, so Allah is outside of that statement, essentially. So it's not kufr. That's my clean resolution of that little paradox. We're trying to deal with higher level paradoxes here, folks. So then the paradox of the Ruhudus is that this is the one thing that is a core tenet of Christianity, is a more active role of the Holy Spirit or the Ruach than we see in the Tanakh, where it's mostly delegated to going Super Saiyan mode on various prophets and heroes in times where they need to say something really inspirational or go fight a battle or something like this. Now it's available to everybody. This was the Pauline sort of Hellenic, Judaic, mystical extrapolation of the glorification of the Christ into everyone else. So they do definitely tie into each other. That in some sense, the job description of the Messiah was expanded by Paul from the roles in Micah and Isaiah and perhaps Jeremiah, which are more historical or perhaps eschatological if you go from Daniel. So there are scholars who say Daniel was a Maccabean era forgery and is not really attributable to any historical prophet Daniel of the Cyrus period, which was a couple hundred years earlier. So maybe we discount Daniel. We don't, and obviously in Quranism and Abadism and sort of Islamic modernists who don't love the Hadiths, trying to bring that back in. And this is how Muslims have tried to reconcile this messianic paradox in the Quran, that there's a lot left to the reader there, as they say, oh, well, maybe like Daniel is basically true vis-a-vis this. And here we have this Hadith and we affirm this Hadith. So Christ is going to come back. But actually, like in Christianity, and this is not contested, so many things about Christianity are contested. The ecclesia, the Mariology, obviously they go really deep with that. They love to have a mother figure in religion. They kind of run away. It's a lot of gulul. Obviously the Trinity, the sonship. These are like all these core things in Christianity are contested, but Ruhudus is never contested. Ruhudus is affirmed. Ruhudus is used repletely in the Quran. It is associated with the empowerment of the Christ, and it's like it's a massive blind spot. And then what Muslims have done is they've invented a doctrine which is actually also not just, it's not in the Quran. The Quran says uswa hasana. He's a good example, not a Hassan. He's not the best example. He's a good example, and it uses this language to describe Ibrahim alayhi salam as well. So, and we make no distinction between the messengers. So, this idea of isma, that all these prophets are infallible, when the Quran mentions them earning forgiveness and turning back, or David alayhi salam turned back repeatedly, as an allusion to his sins, and it doesn't tastefully doesn't go into recapitulating this detail in the Quran, but paints a nice picture of David. But so the Nabi paradox for me is that they've tried to fill the Ruhudus paradox and the Messianic paradox by essentially making the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam the Messiah, even though the Quran is quite clear about who's the Messiah. And they've made him the exclusive carrier of Wahi vis-a-vis Holy Spirit supererogatory levels of wisdom and guidance. And then they made the Holy Spirit into Jibril alayhi salam, who's also performing a role, but it's not, Jibril's role is not to make a baby be able to talk. If a 12-year-old who can talk were given texts, were given words from Jibril, then they would be able to speak it, because 12-year-olds can speak, but not babies. Okay, so even if those the Pakistan of James, or the infancy gospel of James, is not a literal story that is a factual account. The Quran doesn't need to care about that, because there's actually something incredibly deep and important about what the Quran is illustrating and what it is fundamentally affirming in that story, which is that this is how, in the other part of the Quran, it says that we supported him through the Holy Spirit, and is a talking baby. This is a talking baby. Okay. So the talking baby, Christians get the Quran, and they're not familiar with the Apocrypha. They're not like weirdos who've studied all this Super Mario 2, the lost level stuff associated with Christianity. So they hear it like for the first time in the Quran, and they're a little thrown. They're into Jesus. They believe Jesus did all these miracles, so they should be able to bite this apple of Jesus as a baby, having a whole speech planned, but not not like this. And also, it's subverting that the original infancy gospel says, I am, the Son of God, and in the Quran it's like, I'm a prophet of God. So it's the lower Christology, and yet we have this super low Christology. It's even technically, it's a little bit lower than adoptionism, which is probably closer to the original Ebionite Christology. And then yet we have Muslims running in the other direction with the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam, and turning him into either the best human to ever live, so he's somehow one up Jesus. So they've made kufa around these statements of, we make no distinction between the messengers. Perhaps they interpret them as, yeah, the Quran is saying we make no distinction between those messengers, but then the one who is the Holden Caulfield narrator of the Quran is outside of that, and it caps it off and is above them all. This is basically Sunni doctrine, and Shia doctrine is really just running further with that by extending it to other descendants. And obviously we generally don't agree with that as Mutazili or Quran centric or Quranists, right? When the Quran says we make no distinction between any of his messengers, that's without exception. And so the way that I resolve the paradox of the Nabi, which is also the core of this debate about, Quranists aren't really following the Quran because the Quran is saying follow the messenger, and then there's no, but it says Nabi or messenger. There's the nuance in those two. And I just keep contemplating the verse that ends Surah Kaf, that I am just a man like you, to whom it has been revealed that our God is one God. And of course, there's the hadith, I'm no better than Yunus. And it's like, well, Yunus seems like a pretty low ranking prophet, but Yunus was very successful, right? Yunus was more successful than many prophets, than most prophets. Technically, more as far as just doing numbers while he was alive, more successful than the Messiah. The Messiah's impact is all mostly posthumous. He only really influenced, a few hundred people, maybe 1,000 to 1,000 people were convinced by him while he was alive, and not the millions and millions to follow, right? This was the work of later imams, you might say, like James, or you could debate about, Paul's role, or even Marcion's role, and so on. And so that's a paradox. So then let's move this along. So these are like the core. We've established, okay, God is beyond everything, and that's kind of paradoxical, because everything is this, has to define everything, there becomes a recursive set. So we say, well, God is outside that, and that's how we resolve that. Then there's Tawhid. We say, well, God is one, but how does God act? If God is like this transcendent, does God have organs of action? And we say it's just, you kind of embrace the paradox through revelation. That distinguishes us from the Platonists, or from these compromises of theology. And then we get to, okay, so God's core action has been guiding us through either subtle guidance or these texts, and these texts are kind of confusing and they're supposed to have a continuity. How do you work that out? And you say, well, okay, there's the Ruhudus does guidance, there's a high level in the Messiah, nobody's perfect. You have the Nabi's actually there to be humble. This is the Risala. It's not to say, oh, now we have this Arab Messiah and we're gonna, like, instead of brushing our teeth with a toothbrush, we're gonna use a mishwak because that's what he used. No, he was teaching you dental hygiene, folks. Use the toothbrush is better technology. Just use the toothbrush. You're not, God doesn't give you extra points for the mishwak. Maybe I'm wrong about that, right? I'm always willing to, especially something like this, which is about just minor boosts on Judgment Day. It's not a make or break. It's not, should we beat our wives or should we take slaves and so on, right? Like, should we kill people that disagree with us about religion? These are fundamental questions. The mishwak versus the toothbrush. I'm willing to go on the principle side and say, this is serving the principle better to have these efficiently manufactured toothbrushes that have more bristles. They're more effective. You can brush your teeth more quickly with them. But, teach their own. And then we get into the pragmatic application of what you would call the Sharia. So there's the paradox of secularism. Is secularism kufr, or is it actually divine law, or is it something in between? And a lot of Muslims have a hard time with this, and I would say that actually secularism is part of the Quranic commandment, Iqra fi din. You're mushrik if you're sectarianism. So if you're gonna, like, call the Shafis dhimmis because you're used to this being a Hanafi place, that's kind of a bit idolatrous, and so they came up with the Sunni ecumenical umbrella, so that no, the Shafis are okay, like they have their madhab. That's secularism, folks. The term secular was coined in the Peace of Westphalia, where if the ruler of a particular polity was a Lutheran, then you would be Lutheran. So it wasn't even that everyone can be, a Hare Krishna or whatever living under the Lutheran prince. Okay, it was that you pick your locality and then you follow that religion of that ruler, and if you don't like it, you move somewhere else. So it wasn't even pluralism. Okay, it was secular in the sense of we're going to respect the sections of different religious orientations, and we're not going to go to war with each other. And that was the Peace of Westphalia, and this is how Europe began to overcome what Muslims are still struggling with, as you can see even from, like, Athari versus Ashari debates on Twitter, and then the much more vile language against Shia, or of course Shia also dish it out because they've had enough of it. So you have some very sectarian Shia and so on, and it's like this is clearly manifesting in geopolitical strife that is holding back the Muslim world. And there's something that Muslims could learn from this prototype secularism of the Peace of Westphalia. And then once you say, well, it's better for business if we have like a city, and so now we got some Hare Krishnas and some Muslims and some Jews and some of these, and some Quakers and some Seventh-day Adventists and so on and so forth. Okay, well, now we adopt pluralism because it's good for business. And this is not a betrayal of God. This is fulfilling God's commandments. You can't compel people to believe, even if they're in the same sect, the same school of theology, the same school of legal jurisprudence. They're still going to have different interpretations. And as long as they're arguing in good faith, that's how they're going to answer for their particular takes to God on the day of judgment. And it's not your business to go around executing them or bullying them, or telling them, no, you have to believe this just because. That there's a reasonness behind our beliefs. We have an epistemology, and this deepens our faith. It doesn't challenge it. And if it does challenge it, then maybe we can change positions, and then we find a deeper faith in something that, inshallah, is more wise. So, Dr. Sherman Jackson, who's an African American Muslim, wrote this book, The Islamic Secular, where he said, well, he took a more intermediate take, where I'm saying that Islam is secular. And he's saying, well, no, there's like Shari, and then there's this intermediate domain where things are not haram, so they're tolerable to the Muslims, but they are not they're left as an exercise to the ruler, to the voting body, to the municipality. There's no shari parking meter rates that should be set. I mean, I suppose at a certain rate it becomes somewhat oppressive, you could argue, right? But that's a dialectic for the people to go and vote. And these parking rates are it's a vuln. we have to fight this oppression. What are we going to do? Burn down the downtown? No, we're going to vote and we're going to lower the parking rates, right? So this would be sort of the Islamic secular, and I think that was a reasonable perspective. And of course, everybody had a fit over the title because Muslims have a really hard time with this one. And this is fundamental to how we actually move forward as an ummah and how we overcome sectarianism. And also this weird thing of Muslims like want to go to the West because there's so much war, the economy isn't as good back home. But then they're like, oh, we hate the West. It's Dar al-Kuf. Maybe it isn't. I mean, this is what we've been saying in the Qur'aniya movement, in the Reform movement, is that there are things that are fundamentally more Islamic about the United States Constitution that are closer to the Constitution of Medina. And of course, other countries have copied it to varying degrees of success. We have to admit that there's a certain amount of geographic resource wealth that the United States enjoys. It's not all just the idea. Like Liberia has almost an identical constitution, and it's not doing as well. So anyway, so then there's the practical matter of, okay, within the realm of like minding our own business and being religious, how do we go about our day-to-day practice of Islam? Well, we pray Salah. So there's the paradox of Salah. And the paradox of Salah is that you're supposed to only be thinking about God when you're in Salah. And of course you're, oh no, but what am I going to do about this thing? And how much money am I going to have at the end of the month or whatever, right? And you're, I'm astaghfirullah, I'm bad. I need to think about God. But how do you think about God? Because you can't think about a guy with an elephant's head. That's idolatry, right? And you can think, well, I'm an Ashri, so I believe you're in sujood and you're thinking about, oh, the divine will is out there and creating the qadr around me right now, and the divine life is animating everything in creation. And I mean, you might, well, if I am not an uncharitable mutazili. I'm not going to say that is shirk in the same way that going into sujood and thinking about Ganesha it would be shirk. Okay, I have to say that there's a spectrum here, but I don't think it's as good as what I do, which is I think about how great it is that the fundamental reality is this beautifully wise, just thing. But maybe I'm not doing it perfectly either. So I just keep practicing on emptying my mind and humbling myself and accepting that that I'm going to try to think about God, but I can't think about God. I can only think about God. You see, the aboutness is really where you're going with the Salah. You're not actually going to get to God, but it's an effort, and you're training your mind and you're humbling your soul in this process. And this is why we do it so throughout the day, and early in the morning as well. So then there's the paradox of shirk, which is what I've kind of the paradox of Salah's resolution leads us to, which is that if God is formless, of course, if you're an Athari, you can just think of the Baal statue, and you're matching these hadiths, these fabricated hadiths that you affirm. Oh, I'm being terribly uncharitable. Well, anyways, maybe that's the approved form, and that would be their argument. Rather than this divine supercomputer of the Asheris, which is an amalgamation of assertions by Mutakallimun, right? So maybe that is better. I mean, that would be the argument of the Atharis, that we're actually going by revelation here. So here I'm being a little more charitable. And you're grateful for the creator, you're in zikr and you're looking at the tree and you see the bird flying. I mean, maybe you don't get to do this, but this is my little nature masjid here. And you're thinking about, oh, the creations, oh, Allah created all of this, and maybe you really do a good job of it, and you're not doing any kind of association. And of course, shirk is about ibadah. So shirk is that, oh no, I should do things this way because the ijma says so, and that's not what the Quran really means. This is more shirk, especially when we're talking about like killing people or oppressing people, being a bigot, and so on. So that's the good news, right? Is that there's a pragmatic aspect to this. Okay, I'm gonna wrap this up. Um, what other paradoxes are there? There's the paradox of nifaq and jihad. How am I supposed to go blow myself up at the Israeli embassy if they don't make a deal today? Or is that murder? Am I doing a sin? Um, so if I just say, well, I need to like raise my family, am I like the sort of munafiqun guys in the masjid who are getting distracted by the adornments of worldly life? And this is a really hard one, and this is why Gaza is destroyed, is because Hamas had their interpretation, and then they got played because their interpretation was so predictable that they weren't thinking in a strategic way at all, and they got used as a tool to justify expansion of Israeli borders and Israeli genocide. Um, so that's the one I don't have a clean answer for, and that's something that we have to continue to contemplate. Um, and there are a few other big paradoxes to contemplate within Islam, and this is why I titled the channel Zen Islam, because you really have to adopt this mushin la yushrik, no mind, no shirk, la ilaha illallah, no God but God, because at some level this is the submission and the surrender, that we can't resolve the paradoxes, but if we open our hearts in good faith, then inshallah we will be guided.